In the narrow language of 1946, the Weinkauf Hotel did what fireproof promised. After the fire, the building was still standing. The problem was that 119 people were not. On paper, the hotel was fireproof. In practice, the people inside had one stairway. Among the guests were teenagers who had come to Atlanta for a YMCA youth assembly. They were staying in a building advertised as safe. By morning, 30 of them were dead. That contradiction is why a fire that began near the third floor, before dawn on December 7, 1946, became a trap for the floors above it. The exact spark was never proved. Later accounts would argue over a cigarette, arson, and the remains of furniture in a corridor. But the spark is not the part of the story that explains the death toll. The better question is colder. How did a building promoted as safe become a machine that moved fire, smoke, and heat toward sleeping guests? The answer begins 33 years earlier, when the Weinkauf opened on Peachtree Street in downtown Atlanta. It was tall for its time, 15 stories, steel-framed, concrete and tile protected the structure. The kind of building that could be advertised with confidence. The word was fireproof. It sounded like a promise to a guest. But in the early 20th century, it often meant something narrower. It meant the frame might survive a severe fire. It did not mean the corridors were safe. It did not mean the doors would hold. It did not mean smoke could not climb. And it did not mean hundreds of people could get out when the only stairway became unusable. This is the first failure in the Weinkauf record. Not a hidden defect, a definition. The building stood on a small downtown lot, tight against Peachtree Street, Ellis Street, and an alley. Because of the lot size and the code in force when it was built, the hotel was permitted to have one stairway. That stairway was not protected by fire doors from floor to floor. It wound upward near the elevators and opened into the guest corridors. For an ordinary night, that might have looked acceptable. Guests arrived, checked in, rode the elevators, found their rooms, opened transoms for ventilation, and slept. The same features that made the hotel usable also gave a fire a path. The guest room doors were wood. Above many of them were movable transoms, a common feature before air conditioning. The corridor walls included combustible finishes. Inside the rooms were ordinary hotel contents: bedding, furniture, curtains, luggage. The structure might resist collapse. The interior could still burn. That is the part the advertisement could not say. The hotel could be fireproof in the language of property protection and still be dangerous in the language of life safety. I am willing to argue that the most important word in the Weinkauf story is not fire, it is fireproof. By December 1946, America had already been warned. That June, hotel fires in Chicago and Dubuque had killed scores of people. Fire service writers, inspectors, and city officials were already debating old hotels, open stairs, combustible interiors, and the difficulty of forcing modern safety rules onto existing buildings. Atlanta had its own warning too. The city had already seen fatal hotel fire. Newspaper attention after the northern fires pointed toward local hazards. But the distance between knowing a hazard exists and forcing every old building to change is where many disasters are built. Fire engineering later made that gap explicit. It described Atlanta's local ordinances as unable to cover conditions like those inside the Weinkauf, even after the lessons of earlier hotel fires. It also noted that when stronger regulatory measures were attempted, they were soon treated as too severe and difficult to apply retroactively. That is not a dramatic scene. It is a more ordinary kind of danger. A city can know the shape of a problem and still lack the legal, political, or institutional force to make every old building answer to it. The Weinkauf was not an illegal ruin. It was a respected downtown hotel operating inside a safety regime that treated construction type as the center of the question. That is what makes the story more disturbing than a simple failure to notice danger. The danger had been named. It had been sorted into categories. It had been made administratively tolerable. On the night of December 6th, the hotel was busy. Downtown Atlanta was full of holiday shoppers and visitors. The teenagers from the opening were high school students in the city for a YMCA youth assembly at the state capitol. They were not background color. They are one of the clearest human anchors in the record, a defined group staying in the hotel because the city was hosting them for civic life. 30 of the dead came from that group. There was also the man whose name was on the building. William Fleming Winecoff, the original builder, lived in the hotel with his wife. The fireproof hotel would kill its namesake, but the episode should not be read as irony alone. Irony is too easy. The Winecoff was a system of choices, a single stairway, unprotected openings, combustible surfaces, no sprinklers, no exterior fire escapes, weak warning, and a late call for help. Each choice could be explained. Together, they left almost no margin. The first visible sign of fire came in the early morning. Sources differ in exact timing, but the discovery is generally placed before the fire department received the alarm. One account places a bellboy near the first discovery when smoke blocked his way after a room service call. Fire Engineering's 1947 review later said the delay between discovery and notification was estimated between 10 and 27 minutes. That gap matters because the Winecoff did not have a wide safety buffer. In a building with protected stairs, alarms, sprinklers, and compartmented corridors, minutes can be absorbed. At the Winecoff, minutes fed the vertical path. The fire is believed to have started near the third-floor hallway, close to where furniture or bedding had been left. The exact trigger remains uncertain. That uncertainty should stay in the story. It is tempting to solve the mystery with a single cigarette or a single malicious act. The record does not let us do that with confidence. What the record does prove is more important. Once fire entered the corridor environment, it met a building that could carry it upward. The stairway became the central route, not because it was made of something weak, because it was open. Heat, smoke, and flame could move through it before firefighters could reach and control the base of the fire. Guests who opened doors and windows, trying to breathe or call for rescue, changed the air supply. Open transoms above room doors gave fire and hot gases another way to enter spaces that had seemed separate. The building did not fail by collapsing, it failed by connecting. That is the midpoint of the Winecoff story. The disaster was not that a fire broke out in a hotel. The disaster was that the hotel gave a small fire access to almost everyone above it. At 3:42 a.m., the fire department received the alarm. Fire companies were close. Some units were within blocks. Contemporary accounts emphasize how quickly firefighters responded once they were called. This matters because it prevents an easy false ending. The Winecoff was not a story where help was simply far away. Help arrived into a problem the building had already shaped. By the time firefighters reached the hotel, people were at the windows. Some were trying to descend by sheets tied together. Some were waiting on ledges. Some jumped. Ladders could not reach every floor. Life nets could help from lower heights, but they were not a solution for the upper stories of a 15-story building. Firefighters used aerial ladders from Peachtree and Ellis Streets. They shifted ladders from window to window. They stretched hose lines into the lobby and up the stairs, but the fire was already moving above them. They bridged narrow gaps to adjacent buildings with ladders. They fought from rooftops and from the street. The rescue became a geometry problem. A 15-story hotel, a narrow lot, a 10-foot alley. Adjacent buildings close enough to matter, but not close enough to save everyone. Ladders that reached some windows and left others above the rescue zone. This is where a diagram can do what words struggle to do. Draw the hotel as a vertical rectangle. Mark the third-floor origin area. Draw the open stairway rising through the center. Then draw a horizontal line at the highest practical ladder reach. Everything above that line depended on interior protection, early warning, or extraordinary rescue. At the Winecoff, those layers were either missing, delayed, or overwhelmed. That geometry belongs in the center of the episode because it shows the difference between rescue courage and rescue capacity. The firefighters could be brave. The building could still be wrong. The most famous image from the fire came from Arnold Hardy, a Georgia Tech graduate student whose photograph of a woman falling from the hotel won a Pulitzer Prize. Firehouse identifies the woman as Daisy McCumber, who survived with serious injuries. That image has become the public memory of the disaster. But the image can also distort the story. It makes the Winecoff look like a story about jumping. The deeper story is why windows became escape routes at all. The answer is inside the plan of the building. One stairway served the upper guest floors. That stairway was not enclosed floor by floor. The guest corridors connected rooms, transoms, doors, and air. The exits available in theory narrowed to windows in practice. For guests above the fire, The central escape route became part of the hazard. The normal way out had turned into the channel through which the disaster traveled. Fire engineering's contemporary conclusions named the open, unprotected stairway as the major contributing cause of the tragedy. The same review also pointed to wood doors, plywood transoms, wood trim, carpeting, painted burlap wall covering, the storage of bedding or mattresses in halls, the lack of exterior fire escapes, sprinklers, alarm system, organized watchman service, and organized guest notification. This list is important because it resists the comfort of a single cause. The Weinkauf was not a puzzle solved by finding one bad object. It was a chain. First, the code allowed one stairway. Then the stairway was left open to the floors. Then hotel materials and room features gave fire fuel and access. Then the warning and alarm process lost time. Then the rescue tools met the height and geometry of the building. By the time people appeared at the windows, the central question was no longer how the fire started. It was how many layers of protection had already failed before the first ladder touched the wall. I read the 1947 Fire Service conclusions as an indictment of a definition, not a mystery about a spark. The report had enough evidence to show that fireproof was too small a word for what guests believed it meant. There is a hard ethical line here. The dead should not be used as scenery. The students, shoppers, residents, owners, and travelers were not props in a lesson about codes. They were people who entered a building that presented itself as safe. The record allows us to say where many of them were placed. It allows us to say that 30 of the dead were high school students attending the youth assembly. It allows us to say that the original owner and his wife died. It allows us to say that many guests were trapped above the origin point and that rescue from the street could not reach all of them. It does not allow us to invent what they thought. It does not need us to. The building tells enough. After the fire, litigation followed. The Atlanta History Center's finding aid for the Hamilton Loki papers describes legal records, witness statements, insurance documents, court petitions, and reports related to the disaster. Those records include inspection reports by the National Bureau of Standards and the Atlanta Fire Department. That archive matters because it shows that the Weinkauf did not end at the sidewalk. It moved into courts, insurance files, city offices, code debates, and the national language of fire safety. The public lesson also moved quickly. The Georgia Historical Society marker states that cities across America began enacting stronger safety ordinances within days. Later code development would put more emphasis on life safety, protected means of egress, fire doors, alarms, sprinklers, and the hazards of combustible interior finishes. In simple terms, the question changed. Not only will the building stand, but can the people inside survive long enough to leave? That change did not erase the old engineering question. It expanded it. A hotel could no longer be evaluated only as a skeleton of steel, brick, tile, and concrete. It had to be evaluated as occupied space, full of sleeping people, doors, corridors, vertical openings, warning devices, and exits that had to work while smoke and heat were moving. That shift is the real legacy of Weinkauf, not the fame of a photograph, not the bitter irony of an advertisement, the shift from property surviving fire to people surviving it. The Weinkauf forced a different set of questions: the number of exits, the enclosure of stairs, the behavior of doors, the movement of smoke, the time before alarm, the distance a ladder could reach, the height from which a net could not save a falling person. This is why the recurring image for this episode should not be flame. It should be a floor plan. Start with the word fireproof stamped across the building, then add one stairway, then add open transoms, then add combustible corridor finishes, then add the delayed alarm, then add the ladder reach line. Each layer makes the promise smaller. By the final layer, the viewer should understand the contradiction without being told to feel it. The structure was designed and classified to survive. The people were left to improvise. The exact trigger remains uncertain. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is the boundary that keeps the story honest. If a discarded cigarette began it, the building was still waiting. If arson began it, the building was still waiting. If some other ignition began it, the building was still waiting. The trigger changed the minute. The conditions shaped the disaster. That is the line a serious reconstruction has to hold. There is no need to claim a hidden plot. There is no need to make the hotel owners into cartoon villains. There is no need to pretend that one person, one object, or one night explains everything. The wine cough is more useful and more unsettling when it is read as a normal building operating under a normal definition of safety that turned out to be morally inadequate. Fireproof meant the bones might remain. For a sleeping guest, that left the harder questions unanswered. How many ways out existed? Whether a corridor would stay passable, whether a door would hold long enough, whether an alarm would reach the upper floors in time. The disaster did not begin when the third-floor fire was noticed. It began when the hotel could be called fireproof, while life safety remained secondary to structural survival. That is what the word concealed, not because it was always false, because it was true in the wrong direction. The wine cough stood after the fire. That was the old promise fulfilled. The record of 119 dead is the evidence that the promise was not enough.